Greetings, all you fellow YouTubers and curious searchers of truth. In this video, I want to address the age-old question of why is there something instead of nothing? I actually want to do two things in this video. First, I want to make an observation about this question vis-a-vis the current debate between atheism and Christianity. Secondly, I want to point out perhaps a new perspective or new angle of attack on the question. Okay, so here's my observation. As I watch a lot of YouTube videos pertaining to this debate between atheism and Christianity, there seems to be a comment that Christians commonly make. It goes something like this. You atheists are just plain dumb because you can't even answer the question, why is there something instead of nothing? Everything has to have a beginning, and your atheistic theories can't even answer this question. On the other hand, we Christians can answer it, and it's obvious. God made it all. So there, we win. No, as honest atheists, we have to admit that we can't answer the question of why is there something. However, as honest atheists, we also fully recognize the fallacy of the Christian position. Christians do a type of intellectual bait and switch on this issue. They pretend they're going to play fair and argue rationally, but then they change the rules of the game. They start their argument with something like this. Isn't it obvious that if there be matter, it had to have a beginning? It couldn't just have been here forever, and it can't just arise out of thin air. Can you possibly give me some evidence where this has ever occurred before in the history of the observed universe? No, you can't. Ergo, if there be matter, it has to have a beginning, and it has to have some kind of first cause, i.e., a maker. To which the typical atheist retort is, yes, but who made this maker? And who made the maker of this maker? Don't you see that this line of irrational thinking only leads to an infinite regress? Can you possibly give me some examples of where infinite regresses occur in the observed universe? And this is where the old bait and switcheroo takes place. Christians now take off their logic hat and put on their magic hat, or as they prefer to call it, their supernatural hat. Oh, it's supernatural. You see, God is outside the laws of logic, physics, and time, and therefore he supernaturally doesn't need a maker, nor even a beginning for that matter. Problem solved. So, at the end of the day, we atheists stand behind our somewhat illogical claim that quarks, leptons, protons, and electrons can somehow appear out of thin air, and the Christians stand behind their claim that even though simple matter can't appear out of thin air, complete, infinitely intelligent gods somehow can. The reason I bring this up is that I believe it tends to deter us truth seekers from wanting to discuss this question of why is there something instead of nothing. We fully recognize that what Christians call a solution isn't really a solution at all. But I think we sometimes feel reluctant to make videos about it because we'll inevitably have to endure the barrage of God made it comments from Christians. And as a result, it's almost as if we've let them inadvertently take ownership of the question. And I wish this wasn't the case. I believe this is a very important question. It's the big question, as far as I'm concerned, and I think Christianity subconsciously discourages us from openly discussing it. Okay, having said that, the second point of this video is to perhaps shed some new light or fresh thinking on this question of why is there something instead of nothing. I want to start by noting a statement that J.B.S. Haldane, a British evolutionary biologist, once made. He said, "Now my own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose." As members of the species Homo sapiens, we've encountered and tried to solve a number of perplexing puzzles over the eons. And there's a type of cycle or a pattern or a trend that I see. Basically, the trend is that we start our attempt to explain some phenomenon by positing an explanation that is entirely intuitive, reasonable, and commonsensical, only to eventually have to reluctantly accept the queerness. In other words, we would prefer the universe to adapt or acquiesce to the way we see things in our local worldview. We fight and try to shoehorn the universe into the way that to us seems logical and rational, only to eventually eat crow, admit our error, and accept the queerness of the universe. Here's a couple examples of what I mean. A long, long time ago, people used to believe that the world was flat. This seemed intuitive and logical because, well, it sure looked flat. Things didn't roll off the edge, and we had no way to know that it wasn't flat. Eventually, however, we had to accept queerness and accept the fact that it actually was spherical. Another example, we used to believe that this spherical world was stationary and that the sun, moon, and planets and stars all orbited around it. This seemed intuitive and perfectly sensible as well. I mean, it sure seems pretty stationary. You can't feel the Earth moving. However, eventually we had to accept the queer idea that even though it seemed like everything was rotating about the Earth was in fact rotating and orbiting around the sun. Again, my point is that we would prefer or expect the universe to conform to our ideas of what is natural or commonsensical, but we often find out that we need to accept its queerness. In this case, with the question of why is there something instead of nothing, we naturally feel that the energy and matter of the universe had to have a beginning. It just seems logical. And the reason it seems logical and commonsensical is that everything else we encounter, whether it be trees, cows, hammers, clocks, or cell phones, had a beginning. These things didn't just appear out of thin air. There was a time when they were not, and a later time when they were. They certainly haven't been around for forever. Ergo, it would only seem natural that the stuff of the universe, matter and energy, would similarly require a beginning. I mean, after all, it couldn't possibly have been here for forever. Could it? How queer would that be? Given this trend I mentioned earlier, given our track record of preferring things to conform to our predetermined mindsets of what's normal, I think we need to open our minds to the possibility that the matter and energy of the universe didn't have a beginning. It's always been. There's a number of different theories today about the overall nature of the universe. One is that we might be in the midst of a post-Big Bang expansion right now. We used to believe that the rate of expansion was slowing down, which suggested that eventually it would stop and the universe would eventually contract upon itself and eventually end in a big collision, which some contend would then cause everything to bang outwards again. The thinking today is that the expansion is not slowing down, rather it's accelerating. Another theory is that the entire universe may be rather static overall, with local pockets that are continually expanding and contracting. Regardless, it could very well be that there never was a beginning to these cycles. They've been occurring forever. There never was a time before there was matter and energy. All of this something has always been here. Always, always. This is certainly a queer idea, an idea that is difficult for our evolved brains to swallow. Only because, from the perspective of our immediate worldview, we've never seen this type of phenomenon before. However, I'm inclined to believe that it's one more queer thing that we're going to need to eventually accept. So, this is the change of perspective that I mentioned earlier. It certainly doesn't answer the question of why is there something instead of nothing, but I think it helps us to perhaps remove a bit of unacknowledged baggage that has somehow obfuscated the issue. If indeed it's always been here, we can begin to think of the universe in terms of constancy, as opposed to having somehow arisen out of nothingness. Again, this slight change of perspective certainly doesn't answer the question, but perhaps it'll stimulate some new ideas on why is there something instead of nothing. I'm Jeff Kosmosky. Thanks for watching.